Hey, Tim Frisch with the Frisch Perspective here. Today I'm going to continue my Bible translation series. And last time I talked about the world's most popular historic English translation, which was the King James Version. And I'm going to kind of continue in that vein today and talk about the world's most popular modern English translation. And can you guess what that is? It's actually the NIV, the New International Version. So we're going to talk about that today. And by the way, this is part of my channel, A Frisch Perspective. If you are not already subscribed to my channel, I would love for you to become a subscriber, so hit the subscribe button, as well as the bell notification, which will let you know about other videos that I've come out with. So let's get into this topic of the NIV. So the NIV, the story kind of goes back to the 1950s with a businessman whose name was Howard Long. And he would witness to different people, and one day he was witnessing, the story goes, to a man who, as Howard began to share the gospel with him and share biblical passages, he began to share from the King James Bible. And the man responded to him, "How am I supposed to understand that?" And so Howard Long began to desire a translation that he could use when witnessing that would be a lot more easy to understand and accessible to people in today's English. And so that's kind of the birth of the vision for the NIV. Now, as I said, that was in the 1950s, but it took really a lot of work for him and others into the 60s before it finally took off. And so in 1965, a committee on Bible translation was formed and commissioned. And this was put together and endorsed by 80 evangelical ministry leaders and scholars. And then it was funded in 1968 by the New York Bible Society, which today is called Biblica. And so this was a big, extensive project and very encompassing of people from different backgrounds. And so it was a great endeavor, and the whole thing was finished, and it took a while because this was before computers, but in 1978 they completed the Bible, and then they did an update in 1984, and that update actually stuck around for quite a while and was used for a long time, but they really felt the language needed to be updated again. And so they updated it in 2005, but it was actually called the TNIV, today's New International Version. And then it was updated again in 2011 and was called the NIV 2011. So most people using the NIV today, and the ones that you see on the shelves, are actually the NIV 2011. Now, this Bible was a translation from the original languages. This is a fresh translation. So if you look at the chart, you'll see it's not updating an existing translation. It's not, for example, taking the King James Version and updating it in any way. It's a fresh translation right from the original languages of Hebrew and Greek. But I do want to point out that it actually does contain maybe some vestiges of the King James Version. You have to remember that when people were translating in the mid-1900s, the King James Version was still very prevalent in many people's minds. And so you can actually, even today with the newest NIV edition, see in John 3:16 really something that is from the King James translation. For God so loved the world. Now the word "so" to the King James translators didn't mean what it usually means to our modern ears. So when you hear that today, what you tend to hear is God loved the world so much. But really the King James is saying God loved the world in this manner, that he gave his only son. And so the NIV is actually maintaining the King James wording there, but maybe a better translation, more up to date, would be God loved the world in this way. But anyway, the NIV actually does in some ways still have more of a traditional sound to it, even though it is a modern translation. So let's look a little bit more deeply as to how it was translated. The NIV sources say that to ensure maximum accuracy and readability, the NIV went through perhaps the most rigorous translation process in history. First, each book of the Bible was assigned to a translation team consisting of 2 lead translators, 2 translation consultants, 1 English-style consultant if necessary. Then another team of 5 Bible scholars reviewed their work, carefully comparing it to the original biblical text and assessing its readability. From there, each book went to a general committee of 8 to 12 scholars. As part of the final review, outside critics gave feedback. Samples were tested with pastors, students, and lay people. Perhaps no other Bible translation has gone through a more thorough process to ensure accuracy and readability. Well, there you have it. When you look at that information, you can see that the NIV is the best translation out there. Well, actually, all translators and publishers that are producing a translation are always very gung-ho and tend to speak very glowingly about their work, which is what you'd expect. But the point is, it really was thorough and scholarly in its approach. And so there are a lot of reasons why it's popular, and I'd like to talk about several of those reasons. The first one is the timing of it. This was in the 60s and 70s, and at this time there was really a growing desire and demand for modern English translations. I mean, at that time you had the Good News Bible, the Revised Standard Version, the New American Standard, even the New King James Version was in the process of being developed. So there was obviously a trend away from sticking rigidly to the King James Version, and there was a desire for more modern translations. However, there was really a need for something that was both scholarly and very readable and right from the original languages. So because of the timing of it and the demand for it, it actually gathered a lot of support and sold very quickly. And the sources say that the initial print run of over 1 million copies sold out before they were even done printing. I mean, right from the get-go, this translation had a high demand and was very popular. So the timing of it is one reason that it was so popular. Number 2 was its evangelical approach. So it really represented evangelicalism. And evangelicalism is a branch of Christianity, or a certain part of Christianity. And there are Christians from all over the world that would identify as evangelical. And so this version kind of represents that group and is reflective of them in certain ways. So it's evangelical. Number 3 is that it is accurate in its approach. Now, it does use the critical textual basis. Not everybody likes that or wants to use that. However, many scholars feel it is very accurate to the original text, and the NIV uses that, and it's very accurate in its approach to translating those texts. Now, that leads to number 4, which is that it's a mediating approach. It's not an extreme approach one way or the other. It's not rigidly a word-for-word literal approach, and it sounds chunky. It sounds really smooth when you read it. On the other hand, it's not too paraphrastic. In other words, it doesn't paraphrase the originals too much so that you just totally lose your accuracy. In reality, it's kind of in the middle there. If you look at the chart, you can see it's kind of in between those two extremes. And so that allows it to be both accurate but also readable to people today. And when we talk about readable, what that means is when you read through the NIV, you feel like, yeah, I really can understand this, and this is the way that we talk and write today. So the NIV has that. Number 5, it's used by a lot of different kinds of Christians, different groups, and different people. And some of those people, by the way, are very scholarly and great endorsements. People like D.A. Carson, or I saw recently that Lee Strobel is an endorser of the NIV. Bill Mounts is on the committee for the NIV. And there are many others who are very scholarly, solid Christians and teachers who use the NIV. So it's used by a wide variety of people as well as some really key leaders. Number 6 is it has a broad appeal to it in its marketing. Even its name just has a great appeal to many people. I mean, you think about it, it's new, and it's international. And so there are some versions that when you read their name, they just kind of are confusing or they're kind of a turnoff. Whereas the New International Version just appeals to so many people. I mean, regardless of where you live or what your background is, it just sounds like a translation that is for you. It's the New International Version. And then number 7, I would say with that, it's understandable to a wide variety of English speakers. Because it's international in its approach, it doesn't matter which country you're from, what dialect of English you speak, you're likely to find that the English in the NIV is understandable and resonates with you. Number 8, it's widely available. As I said with the KJV, one of the reasons people love the King James Version and buy it so much is that it's so accessible. You can get it anywhere and in so many wonderful, beautiful editions. And the same is true of the NIV. It's published by Zondervan, and Zondervan has done a great job throughout the decades of making it widely available, and they're a great publisher. So you can get the NIV very easily and in great editions. And number 9, finally, it's popular because it seeks to be up to date. Now that can also sometimes lead to controversy. I mean, remember what happened to Coca-Cola when they tried to be up to date and they came out with the new Coke? Being up to date and updating things doesn't always work. But in the case of the NIV, they are trying to keep the N in their name new, and they don't want to become outdated. So they actually, as I've said, done various updates, but the most recent was in 2011, and they've particularly followed the trend of updating how we use gender language. Now, this causes controversy for some, but I just want to say here that some of that's a confusion. If it comes to like translating how we talk about God, and we don't refer to God as He, that would be very controversial. But if we're talking more about when Paul talks about people in the church and he calls them brothers, and some translations will translate that brothers very rigidly, exactly the word that's used by Paul or James or other writers. But it's also possible to say, well, you know, even though that's saying brothers, it's actually referring to men and women. So the NIV does things to try to make sure that it doesn't just sound like the writers are talking to men or talking about men. And one example is actually the use of the word he, that pronoun, where Jesus, for example, talks about a person laying down his life. The NIV might say something like, if anyone wants to follow me, let them take up their cross and follow me. The idea of taking that specific pronoun that might be taken as a male and saying, no, we're going to use a generic they. Now, the problem with that for some people is it doesn't sound like good English, and some grammarians would say it's not good English. However, it is the way that we speak today, and it is the way that we use English today. And so even though we may not like it, some of us, or prefer it, it is the trend of the English language. So the NIV is just really trying to stay up to date. And even though some people don't like that, it's one of the reasons this translation continues to remain so popular. Before I get into the downsides, I just kind of want to sum up and say that if I had to really characterize the NIV, I would say that in some ways, believe it or not, it's kind of the King James Version of our day. It has really good scholarship and thorough research behind it, but it's a very eclectic, encompassing translation that involves a lot of different people from different backgrounds and broadly represents a wide branch of Christianity. And it's also in a language that has stood the test of time and people really resonate with it. So in those ways, I think it's a lot like the KJV, and like the KJV, it's become very widely used and very popular throughout the English-speaking world. So with all that being said, it is a great translation, but as with any translations, I think there are still some downsides. And one would be its approach might not be literal enough. I think if you're really trying to make sure that you understand how the original languages were worded, maybe the NIV could be criticized for sometimes not being close enough to the original in terms of how they present things. Again, they want to make sure that it sounds like English, but when you do that, you can sometimes sacrifice what the original was conveying. Another criticism might be that it can be too accommodating to our sensitivities. Again, with that gender language, maybe they're going too far with it. And, you know, I think with the way that they go about things, for some people, it just seems like they're accommodating too much to cultural trends. But again, that's a matter of opinion. It also makes them very accessible to people today and very popular because they are thinking about the trends of our language and our culture. And number 3 would be the textual basis, which is for some people a make or break thing. Some people want to go with a majority text or the textus receptus, but other people realize that there's a lot to that whole textual basis. And so for me personally, I think it's good to have both kinds of Bibles, ones that are based more on the traditional textus receptus and ones that are based on the critical text. I think it's good to have both. And so the NIV, for some people, that's a problem. And then finally, I would say a downside is that there can be a negative connotation to the NIV. I don't think it's the fault of the NIV. I think it's actually because it's so popular. Kind of reminds me of how people feel about really successful sports teams like the New York Yankees or the New England Patriots. I mean, how do you feel about those teams? Chances are, you know, because they're so popular, you either love them or you hate them. And the same is true with the NIV. And we have to admit it is a really popular translation that's used all over the place. And so for that reason, people tend to either love it or really have a problem with it. But I would say that actually speaks to its success. So with all that being said, the NIV is not actually my top translation choice. It's not the one that I use a lot, and I've never used it a lot. That being said, I have read through it. I think it's a really good translation in many ways. Certainly a good read-through translation, and has a good use. So I would say for some people it's going to be their translation of choice. It's just not mine. But you can watch my other videos on Bible translations to get my thoughts on which ones that I like the most. So thank you so much for watching this part of my Bible translation series from a Frisch perspective.